Welcome to On the Ballot, the Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Halley. Thanks for being with us. We're hopping into the recording booth a little before 3 p.m. Eastern. We're back with more updates on election 2024. We're going to do over the next 3 days what amounts to about a 3-part series, just checking in on the results now that the election day is behind us. Today for part 1, we're going to talk about top-line results, and tomorrow we'll delve into ballot measures in all their glory. Finally, part 3 on Friday, we'll get into some analyses, looking at things like pivot counties and rematches and checking in on any outstanding races that haven't been called yet. So let's get right into it. Today, I'm joined again by Joel Williams. It seems like neither one of us have had any sleep in the last day, so Joel, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for having me really leaning on the coffee today.
What day is bad if you've had a cup of coffee? All days are good with coffee. So, all right, well, we're just going to kind of go a little bit of a round table lightning round around, what we know so far. Former President Donald Trump has won re-election. We're going to steer clear for the most part of presidential results because there'll be another day to dig a lot deeper into that level of analysis. And today I want to talk a lot about more like state level races. So let's just dive right in with one of our favorite topics here, trifectas. What is the current state of trifectas looking like?
Yeah, so far we know that there's 2 Democratic trifectas that are becoming divided governments. So the first one is in Michigan, where Republicans won back the state house. And so that'll be a Democratic state Senate, Democratic governor, Republican house. Neither the Senate nor the governor were up for election this year. And then we've got Minnesota, where Republicans could potentially win the house. They've gotten at least to a 67-67 tie in that chamber. The state Senate, there was a special election for 1 seat because it's not normally up this part of the cycle. The Democrats held, and then obviously Tim Walz was the governor there, and that wasn't up. So those are both going to be Dem governor, Dem Senate, Republican House.
Okay, so there's a lot of interesting stuff to unpack there. So first, let's just go with the fact that tentatively, if 2 trifecta changes happened, that's a pretty low number. We usually see, at least a handful. So how does that compare to the last, say, 2 decades that we've been following trifectas?
Yeah, so going back to 2010, this would be tied for the least trifecta changes in an even year. That matches with 2020, where there was also only 2. Obviously, in odd years, it's different because there's like 4 states that ever hold elections in odd years. But yeah, so that would be a really low number. Yeah,
and even right now, though, the number of overall trifectas we're at is at a high point in sort of history where most states are trifectas. What's our overall trifecta count that we're at right now?
So going into the election was 23 Republican trifectas, 17 Dem trifectas, and then 10 divided government.
Yep.
And so this is going to be 23, 15, 12.
So one of the interesting things that we take away from that is that, at the presidential level, a number of states switched from 2020. And, that's really been now the case for a handful of cycles because Barack Obama won with a certain state balance in 2012. Donald Trump won in 2016 in a handful of states a certain way. A number of those states then flipped in 2020. And now we're back again in 2024 with kind of, you could call it some musical chairsing happening. What we're seeing in state government elections, I think, with this cycle and in most recent cycles is there's not a whole lot of ping-ponging back and forth between how a state falls. An example of that, I guess, would be Nevada, where Donald Trump won Nevada this year, but the state legislature remains Democratic. Are there any other states like that, Joel, that we're seeing?
Yeah, there's some really interesting, presidential versus everything else ticket splitting going on that I think people have kind of thought generally politics is moving away from. Other examples of that would be Missouri. They just reelected Josh Hawley, elected a Republican governor, and then they also passed an abortion constitutional amendment and a minimum wage increase as ballot measures. So yeah, we're kind of seeing that across the board. In terms of other state executive races this year that have flipped, we've got 3 in North Carolina. So there was the lieutenant governor's race for the open seat that was held by Mark Robinson. That got picked up by Democrats. Democrats also picked up the superintendent of public education office, which was interesting because the Republican incumbent lost in a primary to a challenger. And then, so that was just a totally different campaign. And then the auditor race there was a Republican pickup from a Democrat.
And then I think in Pennsylvania, we saw the attorney general flipped as well.
Yeah.
And don't tread on Ryan's territory for tomorrow. Part 2 is ballot measures. You don't need to encroach in his space. He's going to get very defensive. But you're right that the way that abortion ballot measures played on the ballot, and again, we'll get into this a lot more tomorrow. that's probably going to be something that gets analyzed a lot more closely in the months to come, because before the election, there was some back and forth speculation. There was some commentary coming out from both campaigns wondering what impact the abortion ballot measures would have. I remember distinctly there was a Trump spokesman who came out and said they were of the mindset that they thought that the abortion ballot measures would actually help the Trump campaign because it would give permission to voters, so to speak, to vote one way on the abortion ballot measure, so in support of a right to an abortion amendment, while also simultaneously voting for Donald Trump. And the way that those amendments and those state presidential votes have broken out, it certainly might be that that is the case. But again, we'll get into that with Ryan a little bit more tomorrow. So yeah, what else, Joel, with state Supreme Court races? We had quite a few interesting ones this year, in part because for listeners, this is actually one of the high points for the number of state Supreme Court justices that are up in a sort of given 4-year window. It's a pretty low point for governorships. Most governors are up during the midterm cycle, but during presidential election, the governor races are a lot lower. It's not that case, though, with state Supreme Court. So what did we see in our state Supreme Court races last night?
Yeah, so just top level for now, just interesting kind of results from overnight. I think we talked about this on the podcast last night, but Oklahoma had its first justice ever to not be retained. And so that was Justice Yvonne Cowger. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. But she was appointed by Democratic governor in 1984. And so now what'll happen is the state's Judicial Nominating Commission is going to send a short list to the current governor, who's a Republican, and he's going to be able to pick one of those 3 people as a replacement from that list.
It's very interesting because in some cases, when a retention would happen, if the retention candidate loses, you would have a subsequent election to replace that individual. So in this case, you're saying what's actually going to happen is the retention election happens, the candidate loses, and then there's just an appointment to replace. So, boy, there's just like a dozen different ways that state Supreme Court.
Yeah, and sometimes it's like the retention. So in some cases, it'll be like, oh, this person serves a partial term and then does retention for a full term in, like, say, 2 years. And sometimes it's, no, they're appointed right now for a full 6-year term. So that just varies state by state.
What do we know from any other states with state Supreme Court judges? I know Ohio had some elections, Michigan had some elections. Were there any other potential sort of balance control shifts that we know of yet?
Yeah, so Republicans swept the 3 races in Ohio, and that's going to move the court to a 6-1 Republican majority, and it went into the election with a 4-3. In Kentucky, they had a 4-1 split on the court, so there was 4 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and like a nonpartisan, unaffiliated member. Democrats picked up a seat there, so that's going to be a 3-1 split. So there's not like a clear majority there. And then in Louisiana, there was a race that was just totally unopposed or uncontested. It was an expiring seat held by a Republican, and 1 Democrat filed to run, so he just kind of won by default. And that's going to be a 4-3 majority on that court for Republicans.
You don't often find races where an incumbent of one party is not running, and that same party doesn't field a candidate. What other surprising results or trends have you seen so far in our sort of early number crunching?
I think it'll be really interesting just from a macro level to get into the numbers and see, which seats were held by incumbents of one party and then won by the other presidential candidate. I'm thinking about it a lot because one of the most recent House calls was Jared Golden won re-election in Maine too. And I think he won by like half a point based on unofficial returns, and Trump won the district by like 8 points this year. So that'll just be really interesting to see how many of those districts come up when we do our next round of analysis.
Yeah, I know. I'm very excited to hear about the rematches, since we know there were 13 U.S. House rematches of 5 points or less last cycle. So seeing how those shook out will be pretty interesting to sort of delve into. We'll give our listeners a little sneak peek for Friday. So pivot counties, which as a reminder to listeners, a pivot county is a county that went Obama, Trump from 08 to 12 to 16. And we've been taking a really close look at these counties over the last few election cycles now. So what are some preliminary findings we have about how pivot counties performed last night?
Yeah, so big picture strokes, Trump won 169 of them, both in 2020 and 2024. So it's like Obama, Trump. There's 5
Need a better
now.
acronym, but yes.
Yeah, we workshopped many names, and we just keep having to add layers every time we have an election cycle.
Yeah.
So they can get a little bit out of hand. But in terms of 2020 and 2024, so that's 169, Trump won both. We had 2 counties that actually split Trump in 2020 and then Harris in 2024. So that's pretty interesting. We have 14 pivots that went Trump in 16, Biden in 20, back to Trump this cycle. And then we have 7 that did Trump, Biden, Harris. So we may come up with better acronyms for those. We'll have to see how that plays out once we start brainstorming some ideas.
Yeah, and just kind of a reminder for listeners about the U.S. House and U.S. House seat changes. It's pretty rare for large numbers of U.S. House seats to flip during a presidential election cycle. So kind of going back a number of years, I'll kind of read through them. In 2020, there was a net gain of 12 seats for Republicans. In 2016, there was a net gain of 6 seats for Democrats. 2012, net gain of 7 seats for Democrats. Now, 2008, this is kind of the outlier. Republicans lost 24 seats that year. 2004, Republicans gained 3 seats. In 2000, Democrats gained 1 seat. 1996, Democrats gained 3 seats. 1992, Republicans gained 9 seats. 1988, Republicans lost 3 seats. So you can tell the trend here is that most presidential election cycles, there's a single-digit seat flip one way or the other in the U.S. House. So it's pretty rare to see sort of what we would call wave-like elections. Those typically would happen in midterm cycles. 2010, a 63-seat swing. 2006, a 30-seat swing. 1994, 54-seat swing. 1982, a 26-seat swing. So just wanted to sort of contextualize for our listeners that large U.S. House seat changes typically don't occur during a presidential election cycle.
Yeah, one other interesting possibility that I guess at this point is still on the table, we won't know the House until like Arizona and Oregon and Washington and California count all of their votes. We could end up with a Democratic House. Like there could be enough seats that change hands there to end up with a Democratic House and enough seats changed in the Senate to end up with a Republican Senate. So that's, again, more of that like really interesting split ticket voting that could be going on.
Yeah, let's go back to, you mentioned Minnesota earlier. So that sounds like that could end up being a tied legislative chamber. That's also a pretty rare occurrence. But that has happened in recent years. So what are some other tied situations, and how does that play out in a chamber like that? If there's a tie, how do they proceed with their legislative leadership selections, committee assignments, and things like that?
Yeah, so we looked at Minnesota specifically, and their House actually had a really interesting like archival page about this. So this happened once in the late 70s in Minnesota, and essentially what they interpreted state law to mean back then, and I guess it would be open to interpretation today if they wanted to test it, was that the Secretary of State becomes like acting Speaker of the House until they can vote and pick someone to be Speaker. It looks like back in the 70s, they had a bunch of different proposals going back and forth over, your side can be Speaker, but then we want like XYZ committee chairmanship. And it just went back and forth for a while and eventually resolved itself. Like someone eventually caved and gave in. But I think that would be kind of the starting point for that chamber. Right now, the Secretary of State's a Democrat. So I guess technically, if that's what ends up happening, they would like have kind of a pseudo majority to work out like what that power sharing agreement is. But at some point, the two sides are going to have to get together and agree to some kind of power sharing. I don't know if they'll end up with something like in Alaska where there's like, a huge majority of the majority party and then like a couple people from the minority party make a coalition, or if it does stay more like D's firmly in one camp and R's firmly in the other camp. I guess we'll just have to kind of wait and see.
Okay, Joel, good to see you. Go get some rest. I'll catch you throughout the rest of this week and into next week. So good seeing you.
Yep, thanks for having me.
For our listeners, you can learn more about our election results coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back tomorrow afternoon with more results for you here on the show and throughout the rest of the week. Please be sure to subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Palais. Thanks for listening.